Hello, my name is McKinley Melton. I'm an associate professor of English here at Gettysburg College, where I teach a variety of courses in African American literature and culture, primarily in the 20th century, but also moving into the contemporary moment. I'm really excited to be able to gather with you all virtually for this year's family weekend. I always enjoy getting to meet the parents and the siblings and the cousins sometimes of my students. So I'm sorry that we're not able to gather in person, but I'm really excited that alumni and parent relations has been able to construct this slate of virtual programming where we all get to still share in being part of the collective Gettysburg College community. I wanted to talk with you all this evening. Well, it's evening when I'm recording. I'm not sure what time it is while you're watching, but I wanted to spend some time with you all talking about one of the courses that I am currently teaching, and it's honestly one of my favorites. I try not to play favorites, but the reality is this one's pretty high on the top of my list. It's a course that I've designed as part of our first year seminar program, which, as you all are likely already familiar, is a slate of courses that allows our students to enter into the Gettysburg community in a small group learning environment with only first year students, and they generally take this course in their very first semester on campus. The course that I'm teaching now, which I taught for the first time in the fall of 2017, is called Black Superheroes in American Popular Culture. The subtitle is From Nat Turner to Netflix, and I'll talk to you all a little bit about why and how that is communicated to students throughout the semester. The importance of blending a historical figure like Nat Turner with the mass media marketing of Netflix in the 21st century. And we try to think about how the very concept of the Black superhero has evolved throughout time and in correlation with social justice movements, thinking about the movement to abolish slavery, as well as the civil rights movement. And then we also, of course, come into the contemporary moment and we start thinking about questions around Black Lives Matter and ongoing movements towards social justice in the 21st century. So I'll start by saying that when students sign up for the class, in all honesty, they generally come in less interested in the Nat Turner part and more interested in the Netflix. And I'm okay with that. I take that as a personal challenge to get them to start thinking through not only what's going on in their contemporary conception of superheroes and the ways in which Black superheroes have exploded in popular culture and really in American popular consciousness, particularly in the last 10 years or so, largely with the growth of films like Black Panther, which you'll see the movie poster here. But I'd like to get students to first start thinking about how Black superheroes exist beyond just the most popular figures that they have come to know, right? So a lot of my students know, of course, about Black Panther because it was a major blockbuster film in 2018, but many of them are also familiar with a figure like Miles Morales's Spider-Man, who is the first Afro-Latino Spider-Man in this series, having taken over from Peter Parker. And so we talk about a figure like Miles Morales, who is actually the very last thing that we're going to be reading this semester, is a young adult novel written by Jason Reynolds about the character of Miles Morales. We also think about figures like Storm, who has in many ways become the quintessential Black woman superhero, is the leader of the X-Men. We think about other lesser known Black women superheroes like Nubia, Wonder Woman's sister, who is often pushed to the margins of the superhero universe, but we talk about ways in which part of the work for our course is to center those superheroes who are often seen on the sidelines or as the sidekick, such as Falcon, who you'll see also listed there, who is a figure who we often think of as Captain America's sidekick. But part of what I try to get students to think about is what does it mean to take someone who is often sidelined and put them at the center of the narrative? And so we think a lot about the kind of cultural resonance of superheroes. We think a lot about the marketing politics behind Black superheroes, who gets a feature film, who gets to be the sidekick, who gets to be the hero. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about the ways in which we as a culture and as a society envision and allow space for a hero to look like a certain thing or to operate in a certain way. And what does the very existence of Black superheroes do in terms of challenging the ways in which we popularly conceive of a superhero looking like Superman or looking like Batman, right? Or looking like Wonder Woman, but instead thinking through how superheroes can show up in a variety of different ways. One of the core texts that we look at in the class is a book by Adalifu Nama, which is called Super Black, American Pop Culture and Black Superheroes. And so Nama starts off the book actually telling a very personal story about how he himself entered into the study of superheroes. He is, of course, now a college professor, but once upon a time, he was just a little boy who fell in love with all manner of superheroes. And so he talks about the fascination that he gained with superheroes in general. But then he says, it was the Falcon that captured my imagination most and cemented my attachment to virtually all things superhero. Why? He was a Black man that could fly. And so one of the really beautiful things about this study, though it is in fact a scholarly study, is that he starts with the very personal reflection of what it meant to see a superhero who looked like him. As a child, to see a figure like the Falcon possess such great strength and such great superpowers, but ultimately to be a symbol of possibility. And so we talk a lot about the superhero as representation. We think a lot about the importance of what does it mean for young Black boys and young Black girls to look on the big screen and to see superheroes who look like them and who reflect not only their reality and their existence, but also reflect the very idea of what is possible for them and what they may aspire to in some crazy, beautiful way in terms of the imagination and the ways in which superheroes at large really represent for us as a society a aspirational manifestation of the ideals that we think of as worthy and worth celebrating. So while Nama talks about this from his vantage point as a young child, one of the things that it's also really important is that he maps out a number of ways in which superheroes in pop culture also represent far more than just the idealized visions of young children who want to see big, powerful figures who look like them. He says, in talking about the primary mission for his book, that Super Black calls attention to Black superheroes as a fascinating racial phenomenon and a powerful source of racial meaning, narrative, and imagination in American society that expresses a myriad of racial assumptions, political perspectives, and fantastic reimaginings of Black identity. And so I'm hoping that this quote maybe gives you all some sense of the larger so what behind our class, to really think through the ideas in the ways in which Black superheroes represent so much more, in much the same way that superheroes represent so much more, right? They represent our ideals, they represent the things that we aspire to, but superheroes, particularly those who are most popular at any given point in time, also tell us a lot about the prevailing attitudes of the time period in which their popularity hits its peak. Superheroes tell us a lot about American national character. Superheroes tell us a lot about how we view the outsiders and the ways in which we think about someone like Superman, right? The quintessential American superhero, who's also a figure who is an outsider, who is an alien from Krypton, right? And we think about the ways that a figure like Superman represents the best of us, the best of who we see ourselves, the best of how we imagine ourselves to be. But all of that is also framed by a particular context in terms of when that hero gets introduced to American society, what American audiences see about them, and how their meaning shifts and changes over time. When we start thinking about Black superheroes, of course, all of those same questions apply. But we also start thinking about the ways in which racial attitudes are reflected and refracted through the figure of the superhero. The ways in which we begin to think about who gets to be the hero, who gets to be the victim worthy of protection, and who gets constantly cast in the role of the villain. A lot of these things get thought about through the lens of race, as much as it is through class and gender and sexuality, and all of these various different performances and identity scripts that play out for us in some very, real, but also, metaphorical ways on the big screen. that these superheroes are about more than just a fictional story of good versus evil, bad guy versus good guy, right? The damsel in distress, the sidekick, the heroine who comes in to save the day. These stories tell us a lot about who we are, how we see ourselves, and also, really importantly, how we see one another. And so when we think about the role of the superhero, particularly in this first year seminar, I like to get students to really start thinking about the ways in which in a figure like Black Panther or Luke Cage challenges racial assumptions, right? The ways in which a figure like Nubia gets us to really question political perspectives, right? And the ways in which a entire creation of a place like Wakanda gets us to really start reimagining Black identity in some really fascinating and exciting ways. Of course, I am also very much interested in getting students to not only think about superheroes in the contemporary context and superheroes with respect to the figures that they know and are familiar with from Marvel movies and, DC, but I also like to get students to really start thinking about the concept of the superhero as a historical thing. And so we start with Black superheroes in history. The first one that we read is actually one of my personal favorites, Frederick Douglass, who is perhaps one of the most well-known Black figures of the 19th century. He was certainly one of the most photographed figures of the 19th century. He was a brilliant orator. He was a brilliant writer. He was one who dedicated a tremendous amount of energy to the cause of abolition, but he also was a tremendous advocate for the Union in the midst of the Civil War. He was one of the early advocates for women's rights. There are a tremendous collection of his speeches and orations, one of which he actually becomes one of the kind of early advocates for really challenging anti-Asian racial attitudes in this country. He gives a speech in the 1800s on the myth of yellow peril. He really is a brilliant figure who, though a lot of people know him, and though he is often central to Black History Month celebrations, and he's often one of the primary voices that we see in our curriculum, he's still a figure that a lot of people just don't know enough about. So this semester, I taught David F. Walker's The Life of Frederick Douglass, a graphic narrative of a slave's journey from bondage to freedom. This was a really fun text to teach. And I'll be really honest with you all, I teach Douglass a lot. I teach his speeches a lot, I teach his writings a lot, and I love to teach his narrative, largely because I think that Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, when he talks about what it was to endure the institution of slavery and to fight to free himself and to fight to liberate himself, there are ways that I think he often is setting the archetype for the Black superhero in American culture and in American history. To think about ways of grappling with Douglass's narrative in new and exciting ways is always something that I find challenging and something that I really enjoy embarking upon with students. And so the opportunity to do this through a graphic narrative, which is of course not the same thing as a graphic novel, because novels, as we all know, are fiction. This graphic narrative presented a really cool opportunity to really engage with students about Frederick Douglass in a new and exciting way. And so this was the first graphic novel narrative. See, even I slip up, professors even get it wrong sometimes. The first graphic narrative that we read for this semester was The Life of Frederick Douglass. And I wanted to share with you all this opening page because this was a page that we actually spent a lot of time talking about as a class. The literature professor and me couldn't help but talk about all of the various symbols happening here, right? The idea that we meet Frederick Douglass in his older age, in a home of his own, speaks a lot to the power of who he is and who he was, and how he starts off his narrative as a symbol of property, being the enslaved person who belongs legally and in every other way to another family. But to think about how we open this graphic narrative with a situation of Douglass in his own home, in a space where he has moved from property to being comforted by property that he owns himself, and a place where he has been able to build and make for himself. We also spend a lot of time talking about the window, right, as one of our ultimate symbols of perspective and what does it mean to be able to look out into the world. Of course, we also see him holding two tremendously powerful symbols. In the top panel, we see him with a lamp. The symbolism there is pretty clear, right? The idea of a lamp that lights the way, that shines the light, that offers perspective, which is something that was central to what Frederick Douglass did throughout his entire life, where he aimed to shed light and offer perspective on things like slavery that a lot of people simply didn't know, or I might even say didn't want to know about. A big part of what made him the hero that he was is that he dedicated his life to making sure that the evils that our society was perpetrating against enslaved people could no longer exist in darkness. And so the very idea that he lived to shed a light on those things that we often don't want to talk about is in large part what makes him such a powerful forerunner in terms of the ways in which we think about heroes and heroism. The second symbol, of course, that becomes really important for us is the pen and the ink. Right? We've all heard the idea that the pen is mightier than the sword. This is something that Frederick Douglass also lived and embodied throughout his life, as he really tapped into the power of language, the power of literacy, the power of writing. He famously taught himself how to read at a time when it was illegal for slaves to have that particular knowledge, because slave owners understood full well that slaves who would learn how to read would therefore have a key to their own liberation and would start thinking bigger and grander and bigger ideas than anyone thought was fit for an enslaved person to have. So not only does Frederick Douglass find his own liberation through literacy, but also as he becomes a master craftsman at writing and also certainly at oratory, he also seeks the liberation of other people. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the ways that the early life of Frederick Douglass starts with Douglass as a narrator, as an older man in his own home, balancing between the image of the lamp that is lighting the way forward and the image of the pen and the ink, mightier than the sword, which is also helping to blaze a path forward. I also included here a line from David F. Walker, again, the author of the graphic narrative. This is a line from Walker's dedication, when he talks about the importance of celebrating a figure like Frederick Douglass and offering a lens into his humanity as well as celebrating his greatness. And he signs off on his acknowledgments page, Black Heroes Matter. And so it felt to me like that was not only a really good pathway in for our course, but also for this conversation that we're having here as a part of Family Virtual Weekend, to get you all to start thinking a little bit about some of the primary concerns that pulse through this first year seminar. So we talked about Frederick Douglass, for starters, but then we also talked about Harriet Tubman, and we talked about Harriet Tubman as the first Black female superhero. We talked a lot about the ways that she was represented through the photographs and the images of her time. We talked a lot about the ways in which Harriet Tubman exists as a part of collective memory through various different celebrations and art installations and sculptures, such as the prominent sculpture that is still standing of Harriet Tubman in Harlem, New York. But we also spent time thinking about how Harriet gets represented on the big screen, and the fact that the film Harriet, starring Cynthia Erivo, was released and created tremendous buzz and tremendous conversation about the importance of a woman who is often discussed and often considered, but often is thought of in very, very limited ways. And so we spent some time thinking about the media depictions and the media representations of Harriet. I love this poster, Be Free or Die, which of course speaks to the very strong sentiment, right, that we've always upheld as Americans. Patrick Henry, give me freedom or give me death. But somehow we respond to it very differently when it comes from the image of a Black woman who's holding a gun. So we talked a lot about the ways in which Harriet Tubman resonates with broader ways of thinking about American heroism, but yet we still don't often elevate her to the same place as we do a figure like Patrick Henry, who is celebrated for his unending and unwavering commitment to freedom, even in the face of death, even if it called for violence. We also, of course, spent some time talking about the efforts to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill and really thinking through what does it mean to have a figure like her on our money. Actually, Professor Scott Hancock, chair of the history department and of Africana Studies, came in and did a wonderful guest lecture. My students really enjoyed hearing a historian's perspective and thinking about what does it mean to consider putting a Black woman on our money as a symbol of the thing that we celebrate and the thing that we honor and the ideals that we hold dear as a nation. When we talked about Harriet Tubman, the book that we read was Erica Armstrong Dunbar's She Came to Slay, The Life and Times of Harriet Tubman. And the section that I provided for you all here is a brief excerpt from her introduction. One of the things that I think is really beautiful about Dunbar's book, and those of you who are Beyonce fans will certainly recognize the title from Beyonce's Formation, but there are ways in which Dunbar is very intentional about using popular culture, about using Beyonce lyrics to frame out the study itself and to craft a scholarly approach to the life and times of Harriet Tubman that nevertheless feels accessible and feels open and feels available to a broader audience. So she writes, "Here then, presented in a way that I hope is accessible, informative, contemporary, and full of Black girl magic, is the multi-dimensional story of Harriet Tubman Davis, a true boss lady, a superhero, and a warrior." Dunbar uses all manner of colloquialisms throughout the text, but we spend a lot of time talking about how Erica Armstrong Dunbar, though she writes the book in a very popularly accessible way, is still thoroughly grounded in all of the work and all of the training of a history professor. And so we talk about what does it mean to think about what sources are available, to think about where you're able to really speak the truth about a historical figure's life and where you have to make educated guesses and perhaps even some assumptions. And we talked about how certain people get to have their lives and their papers and their documents preserved in the archives of history, whereas others get to whereas historians have to look at other figures and really think through what is the extra work and the extra labor that is necessary when some people's lives weren't considered worth being documented. And so we spend a lot of time talking about the very scholarly enterprise of historical work and to think through how a figure like Harriet Tubman, who is not only one of the chief conductors of the Underground Railroad, in many ways the most famous conductor in the Underground Railroad, but also is a Union soldier who also creates the country's first home for elderly Black people in terms of taking care of them in their old age, the ways in which she moves through multiple different spheres and multiple different moments of activism and multiple different acts of heroism is something that grants her a great more complexity than she often receives, even though she is one of the most famous Black women, one of the most famous women in American history. There are ways in which the popular understanding of a Harriet Tubman is often very reduced to her smuggling of enslaved people through the Underground Railroad. And part of what Armstrong Dunbar works to do is to say that she is about so much more. She did so much more. And a large part of the reason why we don't know more is because historians are limited by a dearth of resources, which then of course begs the question, why aren't there more resources on a woman who is a true boss lady, a superhero, and a warrior like Harriet Tubman? So though we start with the period of American enslavement, we also move beyond slavery to think through other primary powerful moments of activism and heroism in Black history and also American history. And so the book that we've actually just finished reading at this point in our semester, we're about 2/3 of the way through, is John Lewis's March, a graphic novel. And again, I am calling this one a novel because it's a fictionalized rendering of the stories. We read March Book 2 and March Book 3, which really traces John Lewis's journey through student activism with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also the activism that he became most famous for, which you'll see here, is the photo of John Lewis when he and so many others were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday in 1965. And so, though John Lewis is, of course, the author of the book in concert with his team of illustrators, uh, Aiden and Powell, though John Lewis is the central figure and the chief narrator in the book, one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is the fact that even from the book title, which is about March, right, which is the idea of a collective group of people gathering together to fight the fight, to march, to walk the walk, to demand, to protest, to offer a mass mobilization movement and to deal with grassroots organizing. One of the really important and powerful things about what John Lewis does throughout this series of graphic novels is to focus on the group and to focus on the collective. And so, of course, when we think about the civil rights movement, we think about figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who is, of course, shown here on the slide with the American flag at his back, and also even the more controversial figures like Malcolm X, who is shown at the bottom of you all's screens, giving his trademark smile. So there are ways in which we often think about the civil rights movement as a story of great men. Figures like MLK, figures like Malcolm X, these great men of history who led the people toward liberation. What John Lewis does, as much as he celebrates a figure like Martin Luther King Jr., who he does indeed call one of his own heroes. And as much as he is interested in grappling with a figure like Malcolm X, who he often argues, a lot of people saw him as a much more violent and a much more dangerous man than he actually was. As much as this graphic novel series focuses on the people in charge, right? John Lewis is also really interested in the crowd. He's really interested in all of the foot soldiers who are doing the marching. And one of the things that I find really beautiful about this book, and that my students also really enjoyed, is that there's all of these moments where Lewis and his illustrators very intentionally and very purposefully center some of those lesser known figures in American history as well. And so one of those is one of my personal favorites, and I included here a scan of the page in which she is introduced, Fannie Lou Hamer. So he writes, "No person represented more to what SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was attempting to accomplish in Mississippi than a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. She heard James Bevel, another name that we don't spend nearly enough time talking about. She heard James Bevel speak in 1962. And was so moved that she went to the courthouse in Indianola, Mississippi, to attempt to register to vote. When word got around about what she tried to do, she was fired from her job, arrested, and severely beaten. Afterwards, she joined SNCC and became one of the hardest working, most dedicated activists I have ever known. In many ways, Fannie Lou Hamer became the soul of the Mississippi movement." So the narrative there, of course, is powerful and riveting. A woman who was a sharecropper from a family of sharecroppers, from a family of formerly enslaved people in Mississippi, registered to vote, was kicked off her land, brutally beaten, and then became an activist, right? I mean, the very idea that this amazing woman went through everything she went through, lost so much, and remained undeterred feels to me pretty heroic. But what I think is really beautiful and important about Fannie Lou Hamer is that she becomes an important foot soldier in the movement. She becomes an important figurehead. She becomes an important organizer. But she also bravely, in much the same way that Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass before her, set out the task of telling her story publicly and powerfully. So we spent a lot of time talking about Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, which was so powerful and so riveting that the White House actually called a press conference just to interrupt her testimony so that people would not be able to focus on what she was arguing was happening to her in Mississippi. And so much of this story that you see here on this page became publicly known in 1964 at the Democratic National Convention. And so we spent a lot of time talking about Fannie Lou Hamer's biography and how Fannie Lou Hamer came to mean so much for the students who were actively working to bring about substantive change in the midst of the civil rights movement. But then, of course, because it is a course where we think a lot about multiple ways of literacy, we think not only about words and language, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about images, whether we're talking about the moving images of film and television, or whether we talk about the images here from illustrations that are happening in things like John Lewis's graphic novel, or of course, the graphic narrative that we read of Frederick Douglass beforehand. This image was one of my favorites to talk about with the class, because Fannie Lou Hamer is clearly striking the quintessential superhero pose. She's got her arms folded, she stands strong, she stands resolute. But one of the favorite things that my entire class noticed was the smirk. It's the smile. It's that look of confidence that, despite the fact that she was an undereducated sharecropper from a little town in Mississippi, this woman commanded the national stage. She demanded the right to be heard, and she stood strong and she stood powerful. And I think that, considering that I was really, quite frankly, talking to a room full of first-year students, most of whom who had never heard of Fannie Lou Hamer, this was a powerful way of introducing her through an image like this that highlights just how amazing and just how strong and how powerful, even though ordinary, she was. And put a pin in that, because we're going to talk a little bit more about the idea of the ordinary hero in just a moment. So as we thought about John Lewis and we spent time thinking about him and his work and everything that he accomplished, not only as an activist in the 1960s, as a leader in the student movement, but also as a politician who entered into the US Congress in 1987 and remained a member of the US Congress, representing his district in Atlanta, Georgia, until he passed away earlier this year after a long and valiant fight with cancer. By the time that John Lewis passed in July of 2020, he was known quite often and quite publicly and quite popularly as the conscience of the Congress. And in that capacity, he received a number of awards and a number of accolades. Of course, among them is the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was bestowed upon him by President Barack Obama. And so as we read March, one of the speeches or one of the texts that I gave my students to supplement the work was actually Barack Obama's 50th anniversary speech on the bridge at Selma, where he delivered a speech marking the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And so I want to highlight for you all just a couple of those passages, because I think that they speak in large part to what we've been doing and what we've been thinking about and working through in our class. So first, because of course the class is about superheroes, I had to seize the way in which Barack Obama talks about John Lewis as a hero. He starts off his speech saying, "It is a rare honor in this life to follow one of your heroes, and John Lewis is one of my heroes." And so, of course, in this moment, President Barack Obama, is simply speaking about what it is to step up to the mic following John Lewis. But one of the important things about John Lewis's march is that as much as he is dedicating energy in the novel to focusing on his own work in the midst of the student movement in the 1960s, he also moves back and forth between the 1960s and the marches and the work and the efforts for voting rights. He moves between that period and the 2009 inauguration of Barack Obama. And so he paints a very clear through line from the effort and the organizing and the work of these various figures to achieve the right to vote, and the election and subsequent inauguration of the nation's first Black president. And so I like to really think about this line here, not only in terms of the very logistical fact that John Lewis spoke before Barack Obama there that day on the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, but also to think about what it really means for Barack Obama to see himself following in the footsteps of one of his heroes, John Lewis. So he also talks about this moment, President Barack Obama, in saying, as is true across the landscape of American history, we cannot examine this moment, and by this moment, he's of course referring to the violence of Bloody Sunday in 1965 in Selma. We cannot examine this moment in isolation. The March on Selma was part of a broader campaign that spanned generations. The leaders that day, part of a long line of heroes. Again, not only do I seize on this quote because, of course, he's using my class's buzzword, but also because I think that this really very much speaks to the heart of what we've been working through all semester. As we think through the very idea of a T'Challa and a Black Panther emerging out of a long line of heroes that merges the historical and the fictional. But we also think about the ways that each of these heroes themselves, Harriet Tubman is moving alongside Frederick Douglass, who is standing on the shoulders of all of those enslaved people who resisted and fought back against the institution of slavery before them, that made it possible for them to live and survive and thrive and have the lives that they had. To think about a figure like Frederick Douglass and to think about a figure like Harriet Tubman as a precursor to a figure like John Lewis, right, or a figure like Barack Obama, or a figure like Fannie Lou Hamer, is to think about the idea of struggle as a continuous thing, and therefore the resistance to that struggle, out of which heroism is often born, also being a consistent, continuous, aspirational thing that exists throughout the historical record. And so when we think about the role of these historical figures, one of the things that I really like to get the students to think about, and I invite you all to consider as well, is how it takes heroes to produce heroes. How each hero has to stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before, and how heroism is in fact, and by its very nature, not only a historically rooted act, but an intergenerational one, because heroes are often building upon the work of those who came before and ensuring that a legacy is left behind for those who come. Also, very importantly, Barack Obama speaks at the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday March on Selma and says, "We gather here to honor the courage of ordinary Americans willing to endure billy clubs and the chastening ride, tear gas and the trampling hoof, men and women who, despite the gush of blood and splintered bone, would stay true to their North Star and keep marching toward justice." I love this line. We spent a lot of time talking about this as a class, largely because I think that this point here about the courage of ordinary Americans is really important. As much as I enjoy talking about Black Panther and T'Challa and Wakanda and Luke Cage and what it means to be a hero that gets to be bulletproof, I think one of the most important things for me, and I'm hoping for my students and perhaps even for you, is to consider the ways in which the very idea of ordinariness highlights heroism. It's one thing to run into a hail of bullets when you know that you're bulletproof and your name is Luke Cage. It's something else entirely to be a young man like John Lewis who faces down a firing squad with nothing but a book bag, and a book and a toothbrush and an apple on your back. The idea of what it means to stand up and to fight back against tremendous injustice when you are a sharecropper like Fannie Lou Hamer, or when you are a enslaved man like Frederick Douglass, or when you are a runaway slave like Harriet Tubman, who risks your life with no superhero powers, with nothing extraordinary about you except for your spirit and your commitment to freedom. To be an enslaved woman who is literally a fugitive, who constantly goes back into the American South to rescue your family, your friends, your loved ones, and often even strangers, constantly putting yourself at risk in order to accomplish the goal of freedom that other people can experience, the freedom that you are just now learning how to enjoy for yourself. To me, that's a beautiful act of heroism that is far more impressive than anything Storm can do by conjuring powers over the climate, over the environment, over the weather. It's beautiful. I love watching Storm do what she does, but I think that a figure like Fannie Lou Hamer or Harriet Tubman is all the more impressive because they have no powers to call upon. And part of what I think Barack Obama is doing in this speech, that he does very well, is to talk about the insurmountable odds that were being faced by people without superpowers. The circumstances that were being navigated and the challenges that were being confronted by people who were just ordinary Americans, willing to endure the things that they endured because they knew that justice was their primary goal. And so as we think about this idea of the ordinary American, I closed my class just yesterday with listening to John Lewis's final words, which were read by Morgan Freeman. And so I'd like to close our conversation today by doing the same. So I invite you to join with me. Few people do voiceover work as well as Morgan Freeman, but I also want you all to really think about and pay attention to the words, even as you consider the images that are playing on your screen.
Story, when you use your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human. While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story, when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people motivated simply by human compassion laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you've set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself, that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could easily have been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert-goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to stand up, and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence, is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.
So, I honestly don't know that I can say it any better than John Lewis, but I will close with this in terms of highlighting one of the words in these final words that resonated with me the most. I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. I don't need to be terribly hokey about this, guys. But one of the reasons why I love teaching this class and why I hope that you have enjoyed at least just kind of participating in this conversation about this class with me today is to think through the ways in which heroes and superheroes represent so many big, lofty, grand ideas. They represent the impossible. They represent the extreme boundaries, almost limitless boundaries of our imagination. And they represent all that is seemingly impossible. Men who fly, women who control the weather, children who shoot laser beams out of their eyes. But in the midst of all of the impossibility that fuels the ways that we think about the superhero and we think about heroic figures, ultimately, it's the ordinariness that I find most compelling. It's the fact that human beings every single day do what they must do in order to push back against the things that they know that they cannot tolerate, that they know that they cannot allow to continue to exist and persist in any sort of society where they consider themselves one of their fellow human beings. And so there is something in that commitment to change, that commitment to progress, that commitment to justice, when paired with the ordinariness of not having superpowers, of not being an extraordinary person. I find it beautiful. I find it moving. I find it inspiring. And again, I don't want to be hokey about this, but one of the things that I really enjoy doing with students is getting them to think about heroism and superheroism, not as a thing that happens out there and over there and back then, but as a thing that can happen right now with us in here and in here, right? That there are ways that we can do the work of heroism that must be done if we simply have the bravery and the courage to do what John Lewis has asked us to do. I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. So with that, I thank you all for joining me for this brief foray into a course that I'm spending an entire semester on, that I've done my best to distill for you all in just a few minutes. But I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you continue to enjoy the remainder of your virtual family weekend. Thanks for watching.